Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. Hi everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement podcast. And with this being the first episode of the month, I am joined as always by Kelly Barner, owner and managing director of Buyers Meeting Point and general manager here at Art of Procurement. And in today's conversation, Kelly and I spoke to Dave Pastore. Dave is a senior director of sourcing operations at Corcentric and also an expert in the telecom category. Well, Corcentric, they're a leading provider of procurement solutions that transform how companies purchase, pay, and get paid. They're also members of the Art of Procurement Experts on Demand ecosystem and are sponsors of this once-a-month Ask the Expert series. Well, in today's conversation, Kelly and I discussed with Dave the current state of the telecom category here in September of 2020. So let's roll the tape, get straight into the conversation with my first question to Dave. Did you find procurement, or did procurement find you?
It's actually probably a little bit of mix of the two, and I know that sounds a bit like a non-answer, but I started in management information systems in college, and so I always looked at that as sort of a liaisonship between the business and IT, and eventually graduated university, started my first job as an IT consultant working on some e-discovery work, and it was candidly fairly much grunt work. And so it kind of moved on from that. It saw an interesting opportunity to work for a consulting firm called Source One Management Services that specialized in strategic sourcing, and they needed support in their billing department. And a lot of that work was highly analytical because essentially they were, kind of demonstrating the savings that they produced for their clients and so on. And so I always kind of had the outlook that MIS, was that liaisonship. And from my standpoint, the way that, sourcing, and especially in the technology domain, and that's what I was supporting in terms of a lot of the billing activities, kind of all came together, at once. And I think in that way, we sort of found each other.
And from a telecom perspective, now you mentioned a little bit about kind of the IT background, but did you... was it that telecom was a category that you found yourself involved in and, took a particular liking and interest to, or was there something, behind it that motivated you to get more involved in the telecom category?
Yeah, I was always pretty interested and had an aptitude for IT and related technology. So when I was in that billing role, those were amongst the most complex invoices, right? Like sometimes, kind of comparing very granular levels of services and types of services and running, complex reports to kind of get to, where we started, where we ended up, and kind of demonstrating that savings. And so as I, trained up to be able to support those types of activities, it was acknowledged that I was picking it up fairly quickly. And staffing for those types of sourcing projects was particularly difficult, right? Like it was pretty easy to find a lot of sourcing people. It's pretty easy to find technology people, but folks that could do both, specifically within the telecom category, which tends to be more complex, was far and few between. So I started kind of providing analysis on a project basis, and sort of grew out of that billing role. And yeah, I just got really interested in it. It's a like I said, a pretty complex category. And so just kind of learning more about it and learning to speak the language and provide the support that, was otherwise a gap for the company was very motivating for me.
Now, when you think about the telecom category generally, how would you define it? And what I mean by that is what kind of subcategories make up telecom? Because I'm sure, from an outsider perspective, you think telecom and you might think mobile, and maybe not that much deeper than mobile, but obviously it runs a lot broader and deeper. So I just wonder if you could explain a little bit of everything that falls under that telecom banner.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting observation. I think it's worth level setting whenever you're talking about quote unquote telecom, because to some organizations that just means your voice services, right? Or whatever the case is. When we refer to it, we're talking about your wireline voice and data services, your wireless mobility voice and data services, and in a lot of cases, a lot of other things that might touch those.
Yeah.
And it's become increasingly more complex, as you can imagine, as the services continue to evolve. So traditionally there would be in most enterprises a telecom group and an IT group, and there were pretty clean lines between what was telecom, what was IT. But nowadays you have things like voice over IP and SIP services on the voice side of things. You have software-defined networking. You have cloud-connected services to like AWS, Oracle, Salesforce, things like that are baked right into the network. And you have things like integrated security services. So, and it goes on and on and on, right? And so the telecom category at its core is still kind of those wireline and wireless voice and data services. But as you can see, you can't treat it kind of just in a vacuum as just those things.
So when you're looking at that category, and maybe it's a category that hasn't been had a great deal of oversight from a procurement perspective, where do you start? Are there some of those subcategories that are, I hate to use this term, but the low-hanging fruit where you can actually go in and there's typically some opportunity and it's a good way of demonstrating the potential of procurement? Or is that just really, based on individual company circumstances?
Yeah. So, most procurement organizations have kind of some of the technology spaces, one of the last frontiers, right, that they've really built up a strong relationship, with the stakeholders who own those spends. And I would say that telecom tends to be one of those silos, maybe even within the IT organization, if that's the way that it's structured. And so in terms of sourcing, demonstrating their value, I think one of the biggest opportunities that's come up over the last several years has been, some of the additional sort of services that are getting layered into networks and so on have been fairly compelling to most organizations that own, those services, right? In terms of saying, we're probably not just looking at a renewal this time around, right? Like we need to go to market, we need to do a little bit of research and really define our requirements, learn about what's out there and make a good informed decision about what our future should look like. And so I think, in terms of getting started in the telecom category, those sourcing opportunities are where procurement can lend the most value. And especially if there has been a success, in a similar category with the same stakeholders, or at least stakeholders that will have relationships with those that you'll be working with, that's a great opportunity. Beyond that, right, there's a reason that there are so many specialty consulting firms out there that can help with things like audit and service rationalization and optimization and things like that, right? And so in some cases, it may make sense to work with the folks who are responsible for the telecommunication services and identify, where there are gaps or where there may be benefits from getting that type of support. It's unreasonable to expect that, any procurement organization would really maintain a bench that has those capabilities or the time and focus that can be put on something like that. But it can pay, enormous dividends as well to the folks that are managing the category in terms of simplifying, their day-to-day, using up the management, consolidating the supply base, things like that.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of success in the past with, as you said right at the beginning, the auditing side. Because it's kind of some prime categories when you have such a high volume of transactions. to find misbilling, for example, but that requires the investment of a lot of time, as you said, because you were doing it.
Exactly.
To actually find those opportunities, but it can be quite lucrative.
It can be, and what's been a little bit interesting about that is those audits. They used to be gold mines, right? Because you said it's a high volume of transactions. It's quick turnarounds on short notice business needs, things like that. And many of those transactions were low dollars, but they added up, and they added up a lot, year over year, and in and of themselves, just in terms of the volume, but also tariffs going up, things like that. The nature of the services that most organizations are buying today are in one of two categories, right? Largely in the network services category, and mobility is probably going to be about the top 80% of spend, right? And since those are larger dollar items and in lower volumes and generally much more closely managed, and the tools and the know-how is much more available than it used to be, those audits don't tend to be as favorable in terms of the results, which is for the better, right? Finding an audit is nice and finding all that money, but
you want it to be accurate in the first place.
Overspending.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one way of kind of looking at the telecom category. Is any good program is going to start with an audit. You need to know what you have and what your requirements are before you can effectively source or negotiate with your incumbent. But ultimately, the go forward outlook is where the savings is going to be found in a category like telecom.
Now, from a supplier dynamics perspective, do you typically see that, when you think of, for example, mobility and network spend, that it's there are few large suppliers, or is it a pretty fragmented supply base?
Yeah, it's fewer and fewer, larger and larger suppliers. There's been an enormous amount of acquisition activity over the last 10 years or so. Some of the additional technologies that I mentioned, like SD-WAN and so on, have introduced some new blood into the market. But at the same time, those types of players are kind of getting eaten up pretty quickly by the usual suspects, the tier one carriers and things like that. And so, whenever we see these waves of, technology evolution in the telecom category every 5 or 10 years, everybody's clamoring to go to market with the next best thing as quickly as possible. And so, it tends to be a little bit of a Wild West, right? As those things are happening. And so, generally speaking, we see most of our clients looking at the tier ones and tier twos to an extent, and every now and then, they might be willing to, throw a wild card into there just to see if there's something, new, unique, creative that some of the smaller players might be able to do, in anticipation of it kind of being the next, technology to get acquired by one of those larger carriers.
Telecom is one of those categories where, especially over time, as you said, procurement is adjusting to doing business with fewer, much larger suppliers. It makes it harder to negotiate, but it does bring expectations of efficiencies onto the table. Are you seeing, with the consolidation in telecom, opportunities that might give us some hint as to what procurement should expect from an annual expense reduction perspective?
Yeah, that's kind of the key to the telecom category, is that it's been a depreciating market for some time. Every customer is expecting a reduction every time they hit their average 3-year contract cycle, and the reduction is largely driven by competition in the marketplace and new technology and the way that the carriers are investing in their networks. So those new technologies tend to be more efficient. They tend to be lower cost for the carriers to manage and maintain, and higher margin for the carriers, which means you generally have a better position to negotiate them. So, that is the one byproduct of all of the consolidation within the industry. I think that still benefits the end customer. All the tier one carriers have their faults, and the grass is always greener, when it kind of comes to going to market. but at the same time being able to get your technology consolidated, manage one or just a few suppliers, and ultimately kind of take advantage of having all of that under one roof, so that you have the ease of management. But I think maybe even more importantly, when things aren't working, it's all in one place. There's no finger pointing between different technology providers.
Yeah. When you had mentioned previously in some comments that you made that companies are seeing either additional services or frankly new functionality, right, that wasn't previously part of telecom being rolled into some of these agreements, are you seeing the category itself growing in scope? To what extent is that sort of offset by the fact that, as you said, it's these really big players that everything's under one roof, and even if it's a range of different types of services and capabilities, you're still more or less going back to the same player?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's interesting because the carriers can provide everything from, the nuts and bolts of telecommunications all the way to many communications and IT managed services. I mentioned even security, is a hot one. And so, there's a lot more to consider. And again, sourcing individual pockets of spend when the same supplier either owns it or could potentially own it, I think compromises some of your potential, for what you're looking to get out of the category. Right. And I think it's further incumbent upon procurement professionals to kind of look at requirements more holistically. And, if you are going to be involving carriers in a sourcing event for whatever reason, to understand what other requirements those carriers can capture for you, because that's your opportunity, right, to leverage those economies of scale. And I think even more importantly, to not compromise your position from a contracting perspective, because the carriers are notorious for having all different types of hooks into you, whether it's, a contract term, a service level term, spending a certain amount of money each, month or year or contract cycle. And so, you have to kind of look at things holistically and make sure that you're able to take advantage of that without kind of compromising your position longer term down the road.
Right. Now, I feel like these days I would be remiss if I didn't ask you at least one question about the pandemic. So are you seeing either changes in demand levels within telecom or changes in demand for types of service as a result of whether it's the pandemic big picture or whether it's a shift to working from home? For instance, I think I saw an interesting story where the Omaha Steaks company made the decision to send their whole bank of callable agents and have them working from their homes. That's obviously a very different type of telecom service, and it wouldn't affect a B2B company the same way. What types of changes, if any, are you sort of seeing across the board as companies shift to our new normal?
Yeah, there are a lot of impacts that, we've been able to observe. And yeah, you sort of nailed it, right? Everything from contact centers becoming distributed and kind of being one of the most, I think, punctuated examples, to the slow down of the 5G rollout, with supply chain challenges and things like that. I think the most intuitive one is, users are being distributed, right? And so, understanding what that means in terms of the way that the services that you previously relied on might need to change, right? In a lot of cases, enterprises might actually be oversubscribed. So rather than an increase in demand, it's a decrease in demand for the types of services that were needed for example, interconnectivity between offices, data centers, and so on, right? So, there have been a number of considerations like that. And then similarly, as enterprises are making changes to their network, there's certainly been, extended kind of lead times beyond the typical extended lead times to get new services rolled out, while waiting in queue for the carriers to catch up with service orders and change orders. The other interesting impact has been kind of a shift away from CapEx. CapEx tends to be fairly locked down. And so, any IT or telecommunications organization that, had certain plans to potentially build out new infrastructure and own it themselves might be shifting their outlook completely. And that'll completely change their sourcing strategy for 2020.
So are you seeing impact from a pricing perspective as well? You talked there about all the different changes you're seeing from the dynamics at supply demand, but where are we in 2020 from a pricing? Is it continuing? I think you said at the beginning that it was more in a kind of a deflationary environment. Is that accelerating? Is that moderating? I'd just love to know kind of where we are from a pricing perspective right now.
Yeah, it's definitely a buyer's market. The nature of telecommunications tends to support that. It's hard to say what the actual effect of the pandemic has been on that. But generally speaking, kind of like the instance that I referred to earlier, when there are emerging technologies and all of the carriers are trying to, get the edge, and get out to market first. When these types of disruptions occur, it's pretty similar, right? Yeah. And so, carriers are poised to be creative, to sell aggressively, right? To push their latest technologies and to sell those ahead of their competitors, because they know during this disruption, anyone that's looking at the market is likely looking at it with a fairly open mind, right? And really revisiting their requirements and making sure that they're matching up the technologies and carriers that they're choosing to those requirements.
Now, has there been any particular impact on the market of the T-Mobile and Sprint here in the US, at least? I think it was positioned as a merger. Are you seeing that impact on either pricing or, I guess additional services that may be available out of the wireless carriers?
A bit, yeah. Most enterprises have chosen their mobility carriers, and are less and less commonly looking to make changes. It almost becomes an HR issue, right? To certain users like certain devices, or have certain coverage in certain geographies, that sort of thing. So it's not to say that we don't see that. Enterprises are looking, to source or to potentially change their carriers, but we haven't seen an enormous impact as far as a kind of everyone saying, well, need to look at this now as an outcome of that merge.
Now, from an outsider's perspective, from at least an outsider of the category's perspective, it's easy to look at mobility and at some of the network spend and think, well, that's a category. It's a commoditized category. You have multiple suppliers. They're all providing similar products and services, and you can just switch one out and pop another one in if there's a cheaper deal to be had. Obviously, it's a lot more complexity that goes on behind the scenes than that. So I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to what are the switching costs when you think about moving providers, and or is the reality that once you source, you really you're in it for the long haul? It's not something you can just keep switching when a better deal comes along.
Yeah. I think presently it's a mistake to consider it a commoditized category, specifically on the wireline side, but even as I just mentioned on the wireless side, there is more to it than just having a mobile phone in your pocket, right? But if we focus in on the wireline side of the equation, the types of services that are being purchased and all of their interdependencies really needs to be looked at holistically. And that's not to say that you can't segment out certain services, right? You might have just a few internet circuits, or you might still have some plain old telephone service or POTS lines as backup, or, as just lobby phones or something like that at certain locations. And those sorts of things certainly can be looked at as commoditized. But at the same time, the requirements that they're fulfilling could be part of a broader sort of technology adoption. And so it's very important to look at the big picture and not just kind of chase those bits and pieces of things, because one, you're managing, additional sort of pockets of services rather than going with something a little bit more comprehensive that, looks and acts the same no matter, how you're using it across the enterprise. And I think that, that's a big key to the category. The change aspect is really a challenging one, because like I said, when you start talking about people's mobile devices, it's something that's near and dear to them, and it's not just as simple as swapping out a device, right? There are going to be things that are very important to them about what the device is, why they like that device, where they're using the device, and whether or not the carrier is going to have coverage there. And if they are moving around a lot, that's going to be particularly important that it works in all of the geographies that they're working in. And so, in many cases, we've seen clients actually engage HR as part of that policy change, right? To say, this is kind of how we're moving things. This is how we're looking to migrate them, and to ensure that there is no disruption, right? As we move numbers between carriers and get them assigned to new devices, that the devices are kitted or, outfitted with the right technology, that they're imaged with the right security, all those different types of things, right? Is very resource intensive in terms of the internal support that's required to do that, but also is fairly intensive in terms of asking staff and employees to, participate in that process and make sure that, it kind of happens without disrupting what they need to do day to day, and also without disrupting the actual activities that they're participating in.
So I'm actually curious about, we talk about switching. What are some of the telecom specific either risk management initiatives or security concerns, and whether those happen to be items that companies managing a supplier are tracking, right, to protect on their own side, whether that's something that enters into the decision-making process when a switch needs to be made, or investments that suppliers themselves are making that allow them to achieve some type of differentiation?
Yeah, I think from a risk perspective, right now, just to kind of circle back to the pandemic conversation we were just having, is making sure that you're negotiating contracts that provide flexibility to make changes midterm that won't be an excessive cost. Right. And so when we talk about, the workforce being distributed, we would want to make sure that, if the infrastructure is undersubscribed, we have the ability to scale it back and pay less for it. Right. So a good quality contract will provide some of that flexibility and agility to adapt, as things change. When it comes to switching, one of the things to keep in mind would be making sure that you're managing those different ways that the carriers lock you in. And that doesn't just have to do with the contract and the way it's written itself. It has a lot to do with the signaling that you're sending, right? So you could bring on additional services during the contract term, manage the way that those are written into the contract to make sure that you're co-termed and that you have some flexibility to change carriers at the end of the contract and so on. But if the carrier intuitively knows that if you're rolling out, if we use a very simple and obvious example, a major fiber optic circuit build, they're going to know, right? You're not likely to make a change anytime soon. So even if that's only a year or a year and a half into a 3-year term, that's going to be a strong clue for them that you really don't have any realistic intention of making a change. And then I think, Kelly, the last one that you mentioned was on the investment side of things. And one of the great things about, the way that technology is evolving is it's got all the robust sort of redundancies baked into it, either natively, the way that you pull it off the shelf and start using it, or as options that enterprises can carry out. And so I think the state of the world today may have been fairly eye-opening for a lot of enterprises, knowing that those options are available, but never actually considering them. And, hopefully, makes them a stronger consideration, even if not to be adopted immediately during the next time that they run an RFP for those types of services, but at least to have that awareness so that they should factor them in to a longer term plan to make sure that they have the robust infrastructure that they need.
So I just have one last question before we wrap up. We talked about some of the opportunities within the telecom category for procurement leaders to look at. One of the, we always talk about how can we increase the value of our purchases. It's not just about cost reduction. So I wonder if there are some non-savings related opportunities that you see as good opportunities where we can actually help increase the value of those dollars, as opposed to just looking at it purely as, how do we reduce our expense in this category?
Yeah, I think one of the keys nowadays is enabling collaboration. The folks that managing these services have never been in a better position to help the organization sort of nurture, the company's culture, help to support the company's morale, as we're all working remote, things like that. And so now more than ever, the way that the carriers have evolved the services, there's more unification across different technologies. There are more collaboration tools, that are enabled by those technologies. And so, there's an enormous value in helping those that are responsible for managing these services and their carrier relationships to navigate that, identify solutions that will help, the organization as a whole, which tend to be a lot more qualitative than the way that telecom managers usually look at sourcing these types of services, which is generally keeping the lights on versus end user experience per se, right? And so I think that that's one of the biggest opportunities. And then the other one I would say is don't forego the day-to-day management of the category. So we talked earlier about how can procurement get involved with telecom? And I mentioned, helping support RFPs when stakeholders are interested now more than ever to actually consider changing their carriers and technologies. But the other thing is helping to support day-to-day during the term of the contract to make sure that you're managing the risks that we talked about. And that will not only help position you for a better result the next time you do go to market, but it'll help you to make sure that you're in a better position across the board with your spend. You may even get some cost savings wins along the way, but certainly, it's ideal, like we mentioned, to put your organization in a position where an audit doesn't come up with much, right? Rather than finding a bunch of things to be excited about.
Well, Dave, I want to thank you so much for sharing what you're seeing right now here in, third quarter of 2020 in the telecom category. I'm sure it's one of those categories that's always moving, none more so than the last few months with the work from home and collaboration and all the things that you talked about. So definitely a dynamic category. If listeners would like to just reach out, connect with you directly, learn a little bit more about what you do, where would be the best place for them to find you?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you. It's been a pleasure. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm on linkedin.com/in/sourcing expert. You can read my blogs on strategicsorcerer.com, and I can be emailed directly at dpastore@corcentric.com. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to include all those links on our show notes page for today's episode. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. And you'll see all of our latest podcasts on there, or just search for David Pastore. So, Dave, I want to thank you one last time for joining Kelly and I. And Kelly, thank you as well for joining us today.
Thanks very much.
Thanks again.